I want to talk through the changes from the OM-1 to the OM-1 Mark II. So one of the changes that hasn't received enough publicity is the touchscreen functionality improvements on the OM-1 Mark II. So now you can choose the menus and the sub-menu tabs using the touchscreen. So you can scroll through the menu items at the top or the sub-menu tabs, which is the second row right beneath the top-level menu items. So this is something which is not possible on the OM-1 currently. So individual items within each menu still can't be selected using the touchscreen, but the top level menu and the sub-menu tabs can be scrolled through by dragging your finger across or touching each top level menu or sub-menu tab to select it, which is not possible on the original OM-1. This is a firmware change, so it should be possible to also have it done for the original OM-1. Another set of improvements are around subject detection and autofocusing. So there's a simplification of subject detection and focus modes. So there's less menu items and better grouping, in particular when it comes to human face detection. Also, there's been improvements to tracking without subject detection. So this is when you want to track any object by selecting it on the touchscreen and have the camera keep focus on that. And there's also been improvements to the autofocus itself. But the major improvement to the OM-1 Mark II is the human face and eye detection. So now the camera can detect people even if they're wearing a mask or sunglasses, or if they turn away from the camera, so they have their back facing the camera will still detect them and keep focus on them. Although there's one potential disadvantage depending on how you use the camera. With the OM-1 Mark II, you can no longer select to focus on the left eye, the right eye, or the eye closest to the camera, or only on the face, which is something that you could do on the OM-1 and the previous generation of Olympus cameras. Although in my experience, I've never needed to use that. So I think if the camera detects the closest eye to the camera, that's the one you should pick, and otherwise it falls back to the eye further away from the camera or the face or the subject itself. Also, it's easier to switch between subjects when multiple subjects are detected. So if you're using subject detection, let's say with bird detection, and the camera can detect up to 8 birds at the same time, and then you can use the joystick to select which bird you want the focus to be on. All of these changes are obviously firmware changes, so they could be implemented on the original OM-1 as well. The live ND has increased from 64 to 128. So that means the OM-1 Mark II has 7 stops instead of 6 on the original OM-1. This is a change which cannot be done on firmware for the OM-1 because it's using the extra storage space of the newly installed buffer on the OM-1 Mark II to create the images and stack them together. So this change cannot be backported to the OM-1. A new feature which the OM-1 Mark II has is Gradual ND. And with this Gradual ND, you can choose the position of the line where the ND should finish. And you can also choose the angle, and you can choose the placement of the axis you want to rotate in order to obtain the angle. And it's also possible to choose the intensity level, so soft, medium, or hard. So this change is also a firmware update, and it should be possible to implement it on the original OM-1. The only thing is, if it requires a lot of memory, then the levels of ND that the Gradual ND provides would have to be less than what it is on the OM-1 Mark II. But the implementation could definitely still be ported to the OM-1, maybe with less ND levels or less stops. The high resolution mode in the OM-1 Mark II now supports 14 bits instead of 12 bits on the OM-1. And this is something which is not just a firmware update, it relies on the increased memory size of the OM-1 Mark II. So this is not something that can be backported to the OM-1. The image stabilization has improved by half a stop, and there's been no hardware changes according to the OM system that has resulted in that. So it's just firmware updates, which means the improvements to stabilization can be ported back to the OM-1 camera as well as any other Olympus cameras. In terms of hardware changes, the OM-1 Mark II has a larger buffer size. I think it's doubled, which means you can have high frame rates for a longer duration, which is useful for continuous shooting, action sports, wildlife, or bird photography, or anything else that requires high frame rates for an extended period of time, such as pre-capture. So now you can have more shots with your pre-capture than was possible previously. And because this is a change that relies mostly on the increased size of the memory, it's not something that can be ported back to the original OM-1. The OM-1 Mark II has also made improvements to black hat free shooting. So now it's possible to have blackout-free shooting at lower frame rates, such as 12.5 frames per second and 16.7 frames per second. So this is in addition to the 25 and 50 frames per second, which was available on the original OM-1. This is a firmware change, so it can definitely be backported to the OM-1. The OM-1 Mark II has added the ability to assign the menu button to the delete button. So the advantage of that is that you can use your right hand to press the delete button instead of using the menu button on the left hand side of the camera. So you don't need to use two hands to navigate the menu system. Although I would say the improved touchscreen functionality on the menu system has already made this easier. And this is a firmware change. So again, this could be backported to the OM-1 camera. The OM-1 Mark II has also added vertical video recording, which is something which was available on the OM-5. And this is a firmware update, so it can be backported to the original OM-1. The OM-1 Mark II has added UVC and UAC functionality for use as a webcam, so you can use the OM-1 Mark II as a webcam. And this functionality already existed on the OM-5, and it is a firmware change. So again, this can be backported to the original OM-1. And there's two minor hardware changes as well on the OM-1 Mark II. One is the material of the dials have improved. So the front dial and the back dial on the OM-1 Mark II are using a better quality material. So this is interesting because previous generation of Olympus cameras were using better quality material on the dials, and then the original OM-1 went back on the quality and started using a lower quality dial, and then now again they started using a better quality. So when OM system released the OM-1, they actually used inferior material for the front dial and the back dial, and now they've gone back to using a better type of material for the front dial and back dial to make it easier to scroll those wheels. Also, the branding on the camera has changed. So instead of saying Olympus, now it says OM system, and there's a 2 for Mark II of the camera that's visible on the front of the camera. So I think most of these changes are firmware updates, and they could be backported to the original OM-1, apart from a few items in there. So for example, the improved dials obviously cannot be backported, and the high frame rates cannot be done because of the increased buffer size. The high resolution mode in 14 bits, that cannot be done because of the increased memory size. The live ND again cannot be done up to 7 stops because of the increased memory size that it requires. Gradual ND can be backported, just maybe not to as many stops as is available on the OM-1 Mark II. But all the touchscreen functionality for the menus, simplification of subject detection and improvements to focusing and human face and eye detection, the blackout-free shooting, the vertical video mode, the UVC for webcam functionality or streaming, and the reassignment of buttons, all of those things can be backported to the original OM-1. Although it might not make business sense for OM systems, because you have to remember the Olympus photo division was essentially a bankrupt company. So OM system is literally just trying to survive. So it might not make sense for them to even allocate a small amount of time to do the backporting of these functionalities to the original OM-1, where they can spend that time developing new features for the OM-1 Mark II or the OM-1 Mark III. I do think it would be interesting if someone tried to install the OM-1 Mark II firmware on the original OM-1, because I think the firmware would work and all of the functionality, apart from the ones that require the additional memory, would actually function correctly. So you could have improved stabilization, you could have the blackout-free shooting, you could even have the gradual ND, vertical video recording, UVC or UAC, webcam functionality for streaming, and improved focus and subject detection. So if someone has a spare OM-1 and they try that, that would be interesting to see the results. On the 21st of February 2024, OM System announced that they would provide some firmware updates for the original OM-1 after there was a lot of inquiries about it since the launch of the OM-1 Mark II. So they've stated that they will release a firmware update around autumn for the original OM-1, and the changes that will be included in that firmware update will be improvements to some of the autofocus performance capabilities, such as single autofocus and continuous autofocus in all target mode to improve capture of main subjects, as well as the ability to reassign the menu item to the trash can or delete button as a menu access shortcut. So those are the only two changes that will be included in that firmware update. And they've specifically said that that firmware update will not include new features introduced with the OM-1 Mark II, such as live gradual ND and AI detection autofocus for humans. So it will provide some autofocus performance improvements only, and therefore the new autofocus performance of the OM-1 will not match the OM-1 Mark II. So I think OM System has made it clear that they don't intend to provide any significant updates to the original OM1. So based on that, depending on the functionality that you use, maybe the OM1 Mark II is a substantially better camera. So for example, if you use high res mode in 14 bits, and that's a big requirement for you, then obviously the OM1 Mark II is substantially better. But from my perspective, I don't really use the high res mode and I don't use live ND or gradual ND. I mainly use the OM1 for video functionality. And the big improvement for me is around autofocus and human detection, face and eye, and when the human turns around to continue to track them. So that's a big improvement for me. Also, another big improvement for me is the half a stop of stabilization. So when video recording, any stabilization is good, even if it's just half a stop. And I also do like vertical video shooting and having UVC for webcam or streaming functionality. So those are big improvements in my opinion, but all of these improvements are firmware improvements. So I would happily pay for a firmware update to my original OM1 to get these improvements without having to pay for the full price of the OM1 Mark II camera. Anyway, let me know what your thoughts are on the OM1 Mark II because I'm curious to see what other people think and whether people are intending to buy this camera. And if you're buying this camera, which particular features are there that made you decide to buy the camera